On the 30th of December 1812, General Ludwig Yorck von Wartenburg found himself facing a decision that technically was not his to make. His Prussian corps, roughly 15,000 men, had entered Russia as part of Marshal MacDonald's 10th Corps. Prussia was still Napoleon's formal ally, so Yorck was expected to obey French orders. By then, however, the campaign was falling apart. The Grande Armée was retreating west, Russian forces were closing in, and Russian officers had opened secret talks with the Prussians. The Russians were not asking Yorck to declare war on France. What they wanted was narrower, and, for that reason, just possible. Remove his corps from the fighting and stop helping MacDonald against them. Yorck still had a serious problem. Frederick William III had never authorized him to abandon the French alliance. The king had spent years trying to preserve what remained of Prussia under Napoleon's pressure, and nobody yet knew whether the disaster in Russia had permanently broken French power. If Napoleon recovered, Yorck's action could give him an excuse to punish Prussia again. The compromise was the Convention of Tauroggen. Yorck declared his corps neutral and moved it into a designated area, where it would remain outside operations against the Russians for a fixed period. He had not declared war on France, but he had stopped fighting for it. Frederick William did not immediately endorse him. Publicly, the king distanced himself from the convention, and proceedings against Yorck were allowed to begin. From Berlin's point of view, caution still made sense. Napoleon had lost an army before. That did not yet prove he had lost the ability to build another one. Even so, something important had changed. A Prussian general had taken thousands of Prussian soldiers out of Napoleon's war without waiting for permission from either Paris or his own king. To understand why he was willing to take that risk, we have to look at what was coming back from Russia. Napoleon had entered the Russian campaign with forces that, across the invasion as a whole, approached 600,000 men. By the end of 1812, only around 20,000 of the main fighting remnants recrossed the Niemen in anything close to organized condition. Other survivors remained in garrisons, hospitals, flank formations, and scattered columns, and some units had never marched all the way to Moscow. The Central Army Napoleon had personally led east, however, had effectively ceased to exist. Russia had paid an enormous price for that result. Its armies had fought for months across huge distances. Western provinces had been devastated, and military losses ran into several 100,000 men. Moscow had burned. Alexander I therefore had every reason to stop once the French had been driven beyond the frontier. He chose not to. For Alexander, clearing Russian territory did not solve the larger problem. Napoleon still dominated much of Germany and Poland, where he could recruit men and draw on allied states. The Russian army continued west before France had time to recover. That decision changed the meaning of the campaign. The retreat from Moscow was no longer only the end of an invasion. Russian forces were now moving into a part of Europe where Napoleon's authority had depended on allies that had spent years calculating how dangerous it would be to oppose him. Prussia was the first major test. 7 years earlier, Prussia had entered the war with a military reputation built on Frederick the Great and on an army that many Europeans still treated with respect. In 1806, that reputation collapsed quickly. The main Prussian armies were defeated at Jena and Auerstedt. French troops entered Berlin. Fortresses surrendered, and the peace that followed took large territories from Prussia, imposed heavy financial burdens, and sharply restricted the size of its army. From then on, even decisions about Prussia's own security had to be made with one question in mind: how would Napoleon react? The defeat forced the army to change. Reformers such as Scharnhorst and Gneisenau altered officer selection, training and recruitment. Because France limited the size of the standing army, Prussia looked for ways to train more men than its formal establishment appeared to contain. The reforms did not suddenly create an ideal force. Their immediate purpose was more practical. If another war came, the country could not afford a second, 1806. Yet in 1812, Prussia was still trapped inside Napoleon's system. It supplied troops and resources for the invasion of Russia. Yorck's men had marched east as auxiliaries of the same emperor whose army had occupied Berlin. That is why the news from Tauroggen travelled so quickly through East Prussia. Once Russian troops entered the province, anti-French feeling became much harder to contain. Local authorities began raising men, volunteers appeared, and Landwehr formations expanded. Frederick William had initially refused to support Yorck openly, but he now faced pressure from below as well as from Russia. Waiting carried its own political risk. On the 28th of February 1813, Russia and Prussia formalized their alliance at Kalisz. Prussia committed a large field army and prepared a wider mobilization. The two states also agreed that neither would make a separate peace. Russian troops entered Berlin in early March. On March 17, Frederick William issued An mein Volk, and Prussia openly entered the war against France. For Alexander, the campaign was the continuation of 1812. For many Prussians, it was something more personal. They were going back to war against the power that had defeated their armies, occupied their capital, and reduced the kingdom to years of dependence. They did not need to be told what 1806 had cost them. The question was whether the army rebuilt since then could now survive another meeting with Napoleon. Britain had been fighting France for years and was already tying down major French resources in the Iberian Peninsula under Wellington. Its contribution to a new continental coalition did not depend on putting the largest army in Germany. Britain could provide money, weapons, ammunition, and maritime access to supplies, then help pay the governments willing to keep troops in the field. British support grew again in 1813, while Sweden entered the coalition on terms that reflected its own interests. Sweden's role brought an unusual figure back into the story. Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte had made his career in the French army and became a marshal of the empire. After Sweden lost Finland to Russia in 1809 and then faced a succession crisis, the Swedish Riksdag chose Bernadotte as Crown Prince in 1810. Adopted into the royal house as Charles John, he was not yet king in 1813, but he was already directing Swedish policy. He was not returning to war out of loyalty to his old French career. Sweden wanted Norway, and Britain was prepared to support that goal while subsidizing Swedish participation. Bernadotte now found himself preparing to fight the country whose army had first made his reputation. Elsewhere in Germany, governments were much less ready to move. After Austerlitz, Napoleon had reorganized much of western and southern Germany. The Confederation of the Rhine was formed in 1806 under French protection, and its creation helped bring the Holy Roman Empire to an end. The Habsburg dynasty survived under the Austrian imperial title, but the old political structure of Germany had been dismantled. The Confederation supplied Napoleon with soldiers and resources, many of whom had gone into Russia. Repeated recruitment had produced resentment, but Bavaria, Saxony, Württemberg, and the other German states still needed to know whether Napoleon was actually losing control. In the spring of 1813, he gave them a reason to hesitate. Russia had taken away an enormous number of veteran soldiers, officers, cavalrymen, and horses. What it had not destroyed was the French state's ability to conscript. New decrees called up hundreds of thousands of men. Across the empire and its military system, the mobilization connected with rebuilding Napoleon's forces reached roughly 650,000 on paper. Those men were never all concentrated in Germany. Many were still training, serving in garrisons or assigned to other theatres. Even so, by the end of April, Napoleon had more than 200,000 troops available in Germany, with roughly 140,000 concentrated in the main striking force around Weissenfels. The speed of that recovery was enough to make the German states think twice about abandoning him. The new army was not the Grande Armée of 1812. There were still veterans in the ranks, but the proportion of young conscripts had risen sharply. Experienced non-commissioned officers could not be replaced by issuing another conscription decree. The shortage of horses was worse. It affected the cavalry, artillery teams, transport, and the movement of supplies. That weakness mattered in a way that simple head counts did not show. Napoleon could rebuild infantry faster than he could rebuild the mounted arm that had once given him better reconnaissance. And after victory, the ability to stay on a retreating enemy until its formations came apart. By late April, the French were moving toward Leipzig. Napoleon wanted a major result before Austria decided where it stood. The Russo-Prussian army now had to choose between continuing to withdraw or attacking, while the French were still spread along the roads and had not fully concentrated. The Allies chose to fight. On May 2, Allied columns moved against Marshal Ney's Third Corps near Lutzen, south of Leipzig. The opportunity was real. Napoleon's army was still dispersed on the march, and the weakness of his cavalry had limited the information reaching headquarters. If the Russians and Prussians could strike hard enough before the other French corps arrived, they might defeat part of the army in isolation. The Prussians carried much of the early fighting. Around Großgorschen and the nearby villages, they pushed Ney's young infantry into repeated close combat. Ground changed hands several times. French units were forced back in places, and Napoleon had to feed reinforcements into a battle that was already in progress, rather than one unfolding according to a plan prepared in advance. For the Prussian troops, this was the first major test of the army rebuilt after 1806, and it was taking place against Napoleon himself. The desire to settle old accounts did not make the fighting easier. Ney's corps held long enough for help to arrive. Napoleon reacted quickly once he understood the scale of the attack. Corps that had been marching separately were redirected toward Lutzen. As the afternoon went on, French numbers increased. Russian units came in to support the Prussian assault, but the local advantage the Allies had hoped to exploit was disappearing with every French formation that reached the field. By evening, the pressure was beginning to spread across both sides of the Allied position. Napoleon still had reserves available. The Russian and Prussian commanders could remain and risk being caught by the growing French concentration, or they could leave while darkness still gave them room to disengage. They withdrew. Napoleon had won the battlefield, and the Allies had suffered serious losses. But the retreat did not look like the collapse Prussia remembered from 1806. The army remained together. Its artillery did not disappear in a general rout, and the withdrawal stayed organized. This was where the French shortage of cavalry became more than an administrative problem. Napoleon wanted to press the retreat, but he lacked the mounted strength to turn defeat into the kind of destruction his earlier campaigns had often produced. The Russo-Prussian army escaped as an army. For Prussia, that was not victory. It was still significant. The men who had gone into Lutzen wanting to answer the humiliation of 1806 had failed to defeat Napoleon, yet they had fought him directly and remained capable of continuing the war. The cost included Gerhard von Scharnhorst, one of the central figures in the reforms that followed 1806. He was wounded at Lutzen. The injury would contribute to his death during the armistice in June. The Allies now withdrew east toward Bautzen. Napoleon followed, looking for the decisive result that Lutzen had denied him. At Bautzen, the coalition prepared a defensive position east of the town. Around 96,000 Russian and Prussian troops faced a French army that grew toward nearly twice that strength as Napoleon brought more formations into place. This time he was not reacting to a surprise attack. He had the initiative and intended to use it. French pressure across the Allied front was meant to do more than force the defenders backward. Napoleon wanted the coalition commanders to commit men and reserves where the fighting was most obvious, while Marshal Ney moved from the north against the Allied right. If Ney reached the right ground at the right time, he could threaten the line of retreat. Then the Allies would not simply lose the field, they might lose a large part of the army trying to leave it. The fighting continued for 2 days. Russian and Prussian troops gave ground, but kept their formations together, contesting the approaches while their commanders protected a route east. As more French units entered the battle, the difference in numbers became harder to absorb. The critical opportunity came on the second day. Ney had reached a position from which his corps could put severe pressure on the Allied right. Instead of completing the wider movement Napoleon needed, his attack shifted toward the centre. The result was costly fighting, but the route the coalition needed was not fully closed. The Russians and Prussians used that space. Their better cavalry and competent rear guards helped cover the withdrawal. By the end of May 21, Napoleon controlled the battlefield, yet the army he wanted to destroy was still moving away in organized form. He had beaten the coalition twice in less than 3 weeks and driven it far to the east. That looked impressive on a campaign map. Strategically, the central problem remained. The enemy army had survived both defeats. For Prussia, Bautzen also forced a more uncomfortable conclusion. The reforms had produced an army that could take heavy punishment without falling apart, and the desire to fight France was no longer in doubt. Neither of those things made a frontal contest with Napoleon a reliable way to win the war. The coalition needed time to rebuild and to bring another great power into the struggle. Napoleon agreed to give it that time. On the 4th of June 1813, fighting stopped under the armistice of Pleiswitz. Napoleon had sound military reasons for accepting it. His spring campaign had cost men, many of the new soldiers needed rest and reorganization, and the army still needed horses. Supplies also had to catch up after a rapid advance through Germany. The Russians and Prussians were in no better condition. Russian ammunition and supply stocks were under strain, while Prussian leaders had to consider what could still be defended if the retreat continued. At that moment, Austria had not yet entered the war, so the coalition was still weaker than it would later become. For a short time, the pause seemed to preserve Napoleon's advantage. Diplomacy soon changed that calculation. Britain increased its financial commitment. Sweden's army became part of the wider planning. Austria moved first as a mediator, then toward armed neutrality, while its relationship with France deteriorated. Austria was not another small German state deciding whether to change sides. The Holy Roman Empire had vanished in 1806, but the Habsburg monarchy remained a major power. Napoleon had repeatedly defeated Austria, then tried to bind Vienna closer to his system through his marriage to Archduchess Marie-Louise. Austria had also supplied an auxiliary corps for the Russian campaign in 1812. Vienna still had its own interests. Metternich wanted Austria restored to a central position in European politics. He did not want unlimited Russian influence in Central Europe, but he was equally unwilling to accept permanent French dominance in Germany. On June 26, Metternich met Napoleon at Dresden's Marcolini Palace. The conversation lasted for hours and became increasingly hostile. Napoleon accused Austria of exploiting his difficulties. Metternich presented demands that required major French concessions, including a stronger Prussia and a reduced French position in Poland and northern Germany. Austria also wanted territory returned, while the future of the Confederation of the Rhine had become part of the wider dispute. Napoleon would not dismantle the system he had built through years of war. The meeting did not single-handedly send Austria into the coalition. Vienna had already been moving in that direction. What the exchange showed was that the distance between the two governments had become very difficult to bridge. The armistice was extended to August 10, while negotiations continued at Prague. Napoleon used the pause to rebuild his army and cavalry. His enemies did the same, but they also worked on the problem that had troubled them since spring. Even with larger armies, how could they keep Napoleon from defeating them one at a time? The negotiations at Prague ended at midnight on August 10. 2 days later, Austria declared war on France. The Sixth Coalition already existed. Austria's entry changed its scale. Napoleon now faced a major Austrian army able to approach Saxony from the south. Across the wider German and Central European theatre, coalition forces approached 800,000 once the main armies and supporting formations were counted, with several 100,000 more in reserve or secondary formations, depending on the method of calculation. They were not assembled in one mass. The Allies instead organized their principal forces into separate armies, operating from different directions. The largest was the Army of Bohemia under Prince Karl von Schwarzenberg, positioned south of Napoleon and able to move towards Saxony and Dresden. To the east stood Blücher's Army of Silesia. To the north was the Army of the North, under Charles John of Sweden, the former Marshal Bernadotte. The numbers gave the coalition options it had lacked in spring, but also a coordination problem. If one army moved too far ahead, Napoleon could concentrate against it before help arrived. He only had to catch them one at a time. During the summer, Allied leaders and staffs worked on a way around that problem. Alexander I and Frederick William III met Bernadotte at Trachenberg in Silesia. Austrian planning, including work associated with officers such as Radetzky, fed into the discussion, while Russian and Prussian officers brought their own proposals. The important point was not who could claim authorship. The Allies were converging on the same operational rule. They would stop offering Napoleon the kind of battle he wanted whenever he arrived in person. If he moved against one Allied army, that army would give ground rather than risk a decisive engagement. While Napoleon followed it, the other armies would keep operating against his marshals, isolated corps and communications. When he moved away, pressure could return to the ground he had just left. On a map, the logic was easy to see. If Napoleon drove east against Blücher, the northern and southern armies had room to move. If he turned south toward Schwarzenberg, Blücher could advance again. The Allies did not need to defeat Napoleon every time he appeared. They needed to make sure his presence in one place no longer settled the whole campaign. For the Prussians, this required a change that went beyond military organization. The anger that had built since 1806 had helped fill the ranks in 1813. At Lutzen and Bautzen, the reformed army had shown that it could fight Napoleon without collapsing. Those battles had also shown the limit of fighting for satisfaction alone. The emperor could still concentrate forces quickly enough to win a major engagement. By the summer, Prussian commanders had to think less about getting the battle they wanted and more about denying Napoleon the battle he needed. Blücher was aggressive by nature and had no shortage of reasons to fight the French, but preserving the army of Silesia could matter more than accepting a contest simply because Napoleon had appeared in front of it. The coalition did not have to wait long to test the idea. Hostilities resumed in August. Napoleon still believed his central position would allow him to strike the Allied armies separately. Berlin remained an important objective in the north. Dresden was essential in the south. And in the east, Blücher's army of Silesia offered a target Napoleon hoped to bring to battle. On August 23, Napoleon moved against Blücher. Blücher did not stay to give him the decisive engagement he wanted. The army of Silesia withdrew, forcing the French to move farther east if they wanted to maintain contact. It was the summer strategy in practice. Napoleon was there, so Blücher would not risk the army simply to satisfy his own desire to fight him. Then reports came from the south. Schwarzenberg's army of Bohemia was moving out of Bohemia and threatening Saxony. Its line of advance pointed toward one of the central bases of Napoleon's entire German campaign, Dresden. Napoleon could not continue chasing Blücher, while the largest Allied army threatened such an important position. He left Marshal MacDonald to watch the army of Silesia and turned back towards Saxony with the troops he could move quickly. During the armistice, the Allies had agreed that when Napoleon appeared, they should avoid the battle he wanted and use his absence elsewhere. Now the army of Bohemia was approaching Dresden. Napoleon was coming back.